What if Shanks didn't stop Kaido from coming to Marineford? What if the time skip never happened and the crew immediately went to the new world? Or even better, what if Luffy was captured and sentenced to death? Well, I researched these topics for a long time, and here's exactly what would happen. Okay, so you all know how Kaido wanted to come to Marineford and join the war. Thankfully, he was intercepted and stopped by Shanks. But what if that never happened? What if Shanks was too late to stop him? Firstly, let's see which side Kaido would fight on. Would he help the Marines and attack Whitebeard, or would it be the other way around? Honestly, I doubt Kaido would join any sides at all. His only goal here is to kill Whitebeard, and if anyone else tries to oppose him, he will crush them no matter who they are. So how would the battle play out now that there are two Emperor crews on the field? The first big change is that Blackbeard will most likely not show up. He is very cautious about who he fights, and with Kaido there, he'd be terrified and wouldn't attempt to pull anything off. Of course, the Marines would immediately recognize that Kaido is currently a much bigger threat than Whitebeard due to his destructive nature. Still, for now, they'll wait and observe. Immediately after joining the war, Kaido attacks Whitebeard, and the two will clash in one of the most epic battles the series have ever seen. Marco and other commanders would instantly jump in to help their captain, but they are stopped by the king, Queen, and Jack, who tell them not to disturb. Kaido and Whitebeard would be evenly matched, and their battle would create complete chaos, destroying half of the base in the process. We can assume that at this point, Luffy would rush in to rescue Ace and unintentionally activate his Conqueror's Haki, shocking everyone on the battlefield. This, along with the destruction Kaido and Whitebeard are causing, should be enough for Luffy to come in and save his brother. However, Akainu immediately engages them, and since no one is around to help, Ace dies protecting his brother. But as soon as the Admiral tries to kill Luffy, a strong burst of Haki stops him in his tracks. Of course, it's Shanks. Although he was late to stop Kaido, he followed him to the base. He also brought this ridiculously big subscribe button that you should definitely click. Anyway, he would try to help Whitebeard, but the latter would refuse, saying something like, "This is my battle, red hair. Don't interrupt me or I'll kill you too." Shanks would listen and would not try to help him. Sengoku would probably order admirals not to attack red hair pirates and to wait for their chance instead. After a long and fierce battle, Whitebeard is completely out of strength due to his illness, and Kaido finishes him off with one last attack. Having done what he came here to do, Kaido would attempt to leave the base, but seeing their chance, Marines would try to intercept and defeat him while he is still exhausted from his battle. Shanks would use this chaos to safely leave with Luffy. Kaido and his commanders would battle all the Marines, including Garp and Sengoku. What would actually happen here is really hard to guess, but considering that the Marines are at their full strength and that Kaido is injured, I think they would actually manage to bring him down. There are still 3 interesting scenarios left to cover, and the last one is absolutely insane. Alright, what would happen if the time skip never took place? What if the Straw Hat Pirates reunited after only 3 days as they originally planned? Would they still be able to achieve everything they did, or would something much darker occur? Well, for starters, they would obviously be much weaker than they were in the original story, and they would have considerably harder time in the new world. I know what many of you are saying now, the supernovas managed to survive in the new world just fine and become somewhat notorious pirates. Since Luffy was one of the strongest supernovas at that time, he should also survive the new world pretty easily, right? Well, no, that's completely wrong, and let's explain why. There is one important difference between Luffy and other supernovas. Can you guess what it is? If you said that Luffy and his crew consist of total idiots who don't have the slightest sense of danger and would attack anyone they want regardless of consequences, you'd be absolutely right. You see, even though the New World is the most dangerous sea, with good planning and organization, you'd be able to avoid all of the really strong enemies until you eventually get stronger. This is exactly what some of the supernovas did. Hawkins literally uses tarot cards to tell him the outcome of certain events. Law became a warlord, which made his journey a lot easier, and Beget aligned himself with Big Mom. Can you imagine Luffy doing any of these things? Of course not. For example, take the Sabaudi Archipelago arc. Here, Luffy punched a celestial dragon with completely no regard for consequences. An admiral is coming for me? Excellent, let him come. Of course, when Kizaru actually came, Luffy realized just how weak he really was against some of the world's most powerful fighters. If Luffy came across emperors in the show's early stages, he'd probably challenge them too. Thankfully, he didn't. Based on all of this, Luffy and the Straw Hats have absolutely absolutely no chance of surviving the new world. They may be able to leave Fishman Island alive, but as soon as they get to Punk Hazard and engage Caesar Clown, they sign their death sentence. There is no way Straw Hats can defeat Caesar without their time skip training. They couldn't even use hockey back then and were objectively much weaker. So unfortunately, Luffy and his crew would die during this arc. Before we explain what would happen if Gear 5 Luffy was at Marineford, let's first explain what would happen if Luffy was captured and sentenced to death by Marines. Okay, let me begin by saying that this would certainly start the biggest war ever, even bigger than Marineford was. Although capturing an Emperor pirate like Luffy would be a dream of the world government, if they ever actually attempted to do so, it would backfire on them heavily. Here are two important things that Luffy's capture would trigger, and let me explain exactly what those are. Firstly, since there are many countries that Luffy liberated, this would probably make all of them leave the world government as a sign of rebellion. The government would have to send CPO or some other group to quell the revolt, but this would only worsen things as the other nations would see their true face. With this, it's possible that even more countries would quit the government, bringing the world into a state of chaos. But this is not even their biggest problem. Do you know how many people would attempt to save Luffy from the execution? Would you believe me if I told you it was easily over 100,000 people? Just think about it. Straw Hats and the entire Grand Fleet, Red Hair Pirates, the entire army of Alabasta, Bo Hancock and Kuja Pirates, Wano Samurai, remnants of Whitebeard Pirates, all of Fishmen, entire Galley Law and Frankie's family, the entire Revolutionary Army, and even Garp. This would surely be the biggest alliance of forces ever made. Although there are some notable Marines like Sengoku, Kizaru, and Akainu, they would be completely helpless. Even if they execute Luffy before the alliance comes, this would only make things worse for them, as it would be outright mayhem. In the end, assuming that all factions I mentioned can work together, the entire Marine force would be crushed. It's crazy to think that one man alone could unite all these people and overthrow the entire government. Way back at Marineford, Mihawk summarized this perfectly. It's not some sort of special power, but he has the ability to make allies of everyone he meets, and that is the most fearsome ability on the high seas. And finally, the moment you've all been waiting for. What would happen if Gear 5 Luffy was at Marineford during Ace's execution? After awakening his devil fruit, Luffy became one of the strongest characters in the entire series. But imagine if he had these powers pre-time skip. How would he stack against some of the characters at Marineford? And most importantly, would he be able to save his brother, Ace? I will start by saying something shocking. I think Gear 5 Luffy is actually stronger than Whitebeard at Marineford. Think about it. Whitebeard was already old and sick at this point. He had to be connected to medical equipment at all times and had only a fraction of the power and endurance he once had. I am only mentioning this to demonstrate how influential Gear 5 Luffy would be in this fight. Okay, so the battle would start same as in the anime, but everything would change once Luffy falls from the sky and joins the fun. The first major change is that Luffy would immediately use Conqueror's Haki to eliminate all weaker opponents, so they wouldn't be in the way. Remember how admirals were toying with Luffy and not taking him seriously during this arc? Well, that wouldn't be the case this time, as admirals would definitely sense the threat Luffy is posing. So how would the battle play out? Well, I know many of you are thinking that Luffy will just go into God mode and wipe the floor with everyone, but let's be realistic here. Luffy is obviously incredibly strong, but he would be up against 3 admirals, warlords, and even Garp and Sengoku. If you want to stay alive, these are definitely not the enemies you underestimate. Anyway, Whitebeard would also recognize Luffy's strength, and the two would assist each other. Firstly, Whitebeard's commanders should be strong enough to hold off some of the warlords and possibly one of the admirals. The only warlord that would cause some problems here is Mihawk. Still, considering that he wasn't really interested in fighting that much during this arc, he probably wouldn't go out of his way to stop Luffy or Whitebeard. Next, Whitebeard and Marco should easily hold the remaining 2 admirals and keep them busy. This would mean that Luffy's path would be cleared, and he'd head straight for Ace. His first obstacle would be Garp, and as was already implied in the show, Garp can't bring himself to seriously punch Luffy, so he'd probably just let him pass. The only one left now is Sengoku, and this time around, he'd be much more serious and fight against Luffy with all he has. So, can Luffy defeat him? Well, don't forget that Sengoku is really old, 77 years to be exact. He is not as fearsome as he used to be, and since he is a fleet admiral, he probably didn't see much action in quite some time. Based on this, Luffy should be able to at least injure him enough to escape with Ace, but not without some serious injuries. While this is happening, Whitebeard would be stabbed by Squard, which puts him and his crew at a disadvantage. Also, the entire Blackbeard's Marineford's crew will arrive to ambush Whitebeard, and as in the original version, they will manage to kill him. Enraged, Luffy would engage admirals and heavily injure them, but also sustain further wounds himself. By the time Shanks arrives, both sides would be absolutely worn out, unable to continue fighting, and the war would end with Ace alive. Click on this video where we explained 12 insane One Piece theories.